It's slightly embarrassing even to talk about my army part. It was so many years ago. But the grappling with terror over the years, I actually have experience as a minister in the Israeli government, as a justice minister, as a minister of foreign affairs, and also since the year 2000, from time to time, unfortunately received telephones from the secretariat of the government to go and participate at one of the funerals of those terror victims, entire families who were destroyed because of children who were hurt in the Intifada terror attacks, suicide bombers blowing themselves up in restaurants, on buses. And so therefore, when we actually convene these conferences and participate in them, and then you have to understand that Israel has been facing cruel, violent terror over the years. We now have to not only contend and grapple regionally with terror, but also on a global level, of the right of a democratic country to grapple and to contend and use all its available tools in order to contend with this terror. So now there are legislation bills going through in the Knesset. It's a new terror law that I actually tried to pass and placed on the table of the previous Knesset. But it's unbelievable that after so many years, since the inception of the State of Israel, that we were still using British mandatory tools and commands and instructions. My parents, for example, were arrested at the time, but still our laws are based on this. And so the time has come to really have our own legislation, not just based on what was in the past here in Israel, but very holistic laws which would give us the tools to act against Islamic terror and also Jewish terror. And I'm saying that because we've just found out about the death of the mother of the Dawabshe mother because of Jewish terror. And therefore this Israel is extremely wishes to really attack this Jewish terror as well, and it is going to stand on its hind feet in order to do so. And when one looks at all the refugees in Europe and what is happening in Europe, climbing over those fences and trying to somehow break in. So when we know that those who feel mercy for people who are cruel, unfortunately, they themselves will suffer. And I believe that now those refugees that are flooding Europe, so when there are terror attacks that happen in other places around the world, even if you think that these are remote places, they must be dealt with real time. You cannot put blinkers on, because when you close your eyes, you're going to open them one day, and those events that once seemed very remote to you are now knocking on your own doors. And that's what global village means. That is what progress means and the world of the internet. So these may mean demarcated borders, but terror has crossed all demarcated borders. It has none. It crosses all. So therefore, and you can see how they are mobilizing and recruiting people from all over to join their ranks. Now, you don't need to discuss only what is happening with the refugees, but one needs to effectively deal with terror issues, because the terror is what brought these people to have to run away, escape, and flee from their own lands to look for a safe haven. So in other words, the terror has declared unequivocally, fully, that they want, either they're representing a different religion, but perhaps the same religion, but with a different kind of interpretation, but they want different things, and they need to somehow achieve these objectives. And in Europe, what is happening, this is part of those objectives that are being substantiated, which is not only the conquering of other lands in our region, but all over the world because they are fighting against the free world. And so therefore, if the outcome is because of various dramatic upheavals of various regimes around the world, but it's also the destabilization of regimes and the changes of world order, the change of various toppling of regimes, and this is a kind of vacuum that has been created that is drawing into it all sorts of terror organization and rogue gangs. So suddenly things do not settle themselves by themselves. We are accountable, the free world and the superpowers, not only to just actually to welcome in those refugees, but we have to understand that we must now be preparing ourselves for what might also happen. So if we're talking about those issues, if the root cause is not found and you do not promote various shared international decisions in order to act against terror, and you do need an incompromisable military struggle against terror, yes, it's an asymmetrical warfare that is necessary, an asymmetrical battle against it. But you have to fight against people who are beheading people and using such cruel, horrific tactics that suddenly is taking us back into the dark times and the wars of religion in the days of yore. And we believed that that world is something that we left behind. But no, it is still taking place, or it has been re-aroused now. So beyond that decision, that vehement decision about actually fighting this terror, but we also have to think that whether those various sort of moral shackles that we are tie ourselves to, have we brought ourselves around to a situation where we also need to actually act in a very, very unequivocal manner against them and perhaps change our way of battle, because we see what kind of cruelty they use against those poor people who are now running and fleeing away. So in other words, the whole free world is now facing terror, and we must also prevent some kind of legitimization of the terror organizations. And it doesn't matter if it's Hamas or Hezbollah or an entire state like Iran that is in fact a state with a religious ideology that is using terror in order to achieve those objectives that other terror organizations are using. And I admit that in this struggle, it doesn't matter if it's Shiite or Sunni, they are still using the same means and tools. So it doesn't matter if Israel has to actually strategically act with everyone. As far as we're concerned, our threats have changed. The threats that we counter are less organized armies that come to actually conquer us and defeat us, but these are terror threats of a different kind that we have to face, and we have to therefore update our national security approach in accordance with those new kinds of threats. Yes, Dan Meridor is here, and he carried out a very deeply delved approach about our national security approach, and he worked on this asymmetrical war approach, and we have to update our entire concept of national security. And yes, Israel cannot but not only cannot but must actually be part of that international counter-terror war. And that is the agreement with Iran. And therefore, we have to relate to that, because Iran is actually mixing up and cooking things vis-a-vis terror in the area. So it's not only a question of the centrifuges and whether they'll be able to, how and when and why, and achieve their nuclear and atomic warfare, but they already nowadays are giving some kind of legitimization to a state that is actually legitimizing terror. They are going to send a fortune to them and lift that embargo over them. And there is a message being conveyed that the superpowers that are actually agreeing to some kind of approach towards terror. and as if they have chosen, they've made a choice that we believe is a different kind of choice than they should have made, because it is as if they are perhaps turning a blind eye and they're accepting what is being done. We have to actually protect and preserve our Western values, and on the other hand, you have people, extremists, who are either trying to achieve through terror their values, and unfortunately, the agreement might possibly actually convey a message that the Western world is actually turning a blind eye or giving a different interpretation to the Shiite terror through its proxies, through some kind of thought that this will help us all fight together against the ISIS and the Sunni terror. And this must be stopped now. So alongside this harbinger of bad tidings about this agreement, it could also be an opportunity to not only strengthen the State of Israel in their battle, but for that you need a change in policy, and the right strategy must be one that is a dual one. In other words, struggling incompromisably against terror alongside a very strong alliance with the more pragmatic and moderate people in the region, and that should be under the same umbrella of the various superpowers and the United States. But instead of creating irretrievable damage to the security of Israel and to our ties with the United States, after all, our ties with the United States are of vital importance. Instead of dabbling in all the politics in the United States, after all, the train has already left the station, we now need to ensure that there should be a shared effort of the powers against the Iranian terror. So talking about the various polls and surveys in the United States is not a solution to the strengthening of what is happening in Iran. And what is necessary? What should Israel do nowadays? After all, even according to the Americans and the superpowers, what has the United States president said? That the agreement is only about nuclear issues. But we are not accepting the fact that they are only speaking about that. What we're saying is, listen, don't put your money and efforts where your mouth is. I'm not saying that, but instead of that, let us work together in order to prevent what might happen with that little part that you left wide open. So therefore, we have to come and say now, that is what you've said. Okay, it's not detrimental. It doesn't actually have a detrimental effect on the actual agreement, but we still have to work together, create new alliances, create one front as if there is no agreement. Yes, okay, we have to substantiate and enforce that agreement, but let it at the same time have one front against terror, unite against terror. But in order for that to happen, you have to create a new alliance with the moderate Western world that understands the Iranian actual threat and foresees it and understands it. And this is a window of opportunity that must not be missed. The State of Israel in 2002, because it ignored the Saudi Arabian initiative that was afterwards translated into the Arab initiative, we cannot ignore things. We have to see that there are opportunities alongside the threats of this agreement. We have to unite with these pragmatic, moderate elements in the region, and we have to take advantage of that in the State of Israel and unite all of them against Hamas and against terror. Because when we see Mashal meeting with the Saudi Arabians, and I start asking myself, can't we suddenly find ourselves, if we do not act properly and on time, where suddenly the alliances are changing in the region? Maybe it won't be in the favor of the State of Israel, and suddenly the division will be between Sunni and Shiites, and instead of a sort of division between extremists and terrorists and versus the more moderate elements. And therefore, Israel, it is prohibited for Israel and the world to legitimize Hamas and, of course, not to Iran. So we have to create this new alliance with Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, and the Gulf states. And in fact, continue acting against terror. After all, we are surrounded by it in the Gaza Strip, and in addition to the new warning bells that we heard that are extending the extension of time to react when mortar shells drop, and of course you have special alarms and warning systems because of the possibility of threats from tunnels. Now, all of those who talk about the capability of creating a regional peace without Palestinians do not know what they're talking about, because in fact the price, and it's not just a price, the price that will be needed by those states is to create some kind of effective process that will be credible between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that's not a price in my eyes, by the way. That is of our vested interest. That should be the immediate response, the immediate need before Abu Mazen goes to the United Nations to lecture about a declaration under occupation or whatever it is, and the various agreements that he had with Israel that they might, and the Palestinian Authority, he might dismantle altogether. So we have to do something now. It's incumbent upon us to be with one front, with the moderate Western world, and fight against the Hamas and the Iranian terror.
We have to work with the Palestinians, those who advance the processes, but something that keeps our security, but by the way can really pull the rug from the Palestinian programs in the UN, and also reduce the pressure that exists today. Other people who take advantage of this situation in order to continue to act against the state of Israel. And we have to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the reason for terror. This terror is a fundamentalistic religious terror. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is has a solution, is a different thing. Iran is a religious conflict, but even if we solve the problem with us and the Palestinians, this ideology will not change, but they take advantage of the image world of the past, perceiving Israel as an enemy in order to give credit to countries against the state of Israel. They harness them towards terror, and Israel really has to do some sort of political step to change this situation in which we find ourselves today. And therefore, to conclude, side by side with the difficult problem that the entire Western world has to face, and the problem of global terror, there's an opportunity for the State of Israel to be part of the free world instead of being isolated. And this challenge, it's the duty of the government of Israel to grapple with. We had an opportunity to do that after Protective Edge. There was an initiative on the table that I formulated together with the United States and other countries, and that created that alliance that actually determined to have a mutual struggle against Hamas, and beginning of a process without any precondition. Hesitation, unfortunately, on the part of the Prime Minister caused the fact that it was taken off the table, and now, because of these harsh events that are happening and the bad agreement with Iran, there is an opportunity today to create new opportunities. I altogether in favor of looking at threats to know how to grapple with them, but not to forget that there are other opportunities.